Chapter 10. The Rot of the Stars. I heard a knocking at my door in the evening the next day. It was Seven. She looked terrible. She said the discernibles were in her house last night, standing around her bed while she tried to sleep. Of course they wouldn't leave, and she had to deal with their presence all night long till they left early in the morning. We decided to go to the local coffee shop to combat her sleepless night. On the way to the coffee shop, Seven called to my attention the oncoming clouds in the sky. One seemed to be yellow and surrounded by darker clouds. This is an unnatural occurrence we call the rot of the stars. It's an unusual tribulation which we also have to deal with. Orb-like objects that are yet to be identified fall from these strange clouds, and when they hit the ground, they leave a translucent goop called star jelly. The livestock eat it up enthusiastically, and some people use it when baking bread. Personally, I don't touch the stuff. It's really common for things to fall from the sky, anywhere from stones with inscriptions on them, odorless gray resinous matter, seeds of ivy berries, luminous blue silk, and even flesh and blood fell once. But that only happened once. Anyway, when this star jelly hits the ocean, it can stain the water red. That's when it bothers me the most. We decided it best to take cover in a coffee shop till this passed. As we enjoyed our coffee, we came across what appeared to me as a homeless man who was covered in newspaper clippings and afterbirth. We looked at each other and thought, just another confused individual. He kept saying to himself how this world was broken, and our minds were broken. He looked up at us and smiled a very crooked smile at Seven. After staring at her for some time, his smile faded and his eyes opened a bit more. He made an unusual statement in which he said something to the effect that he knew what she really was. I looked at Seven with confusion. I could see she was bothered by this. He then said how, out of all of us, her mind was probably the most broken of all. In the typical Seven fashion, she threw her coffee down and slammed open the front door and stormed out. I looked at him with concern and followed after her to calm her down. She hastily walked to the beach. The water was red, and the sky was yellow with dark and angry clouds following. I couldn't seem to calm her down and thought to myself, she finally just hit her breaking point. She stopped suddenly and turned to look at me with tears in her eyes. Her mood seemed to fit the oncoming angry sky behind her. She'd said, "My mind isn't gone. I know who I am. I know what I am." Just as she was ready to talk to me more, she stopped abruptly. I wanted so badly for her to elaborate on what she had said, but I didn't want to push her. What an odd set of events this has been, I thought to myself as I noticed star jelly beneath my feet. Chapter 11. Night Beach Vacation. Evening television has always been interesting in my house. Seven, myself, and Gray sat around to watch the Barky and Spitty show. Yes, that's right. The Barky and Spitty show. The premise of the show dealt with a mechanical 8-foot cat and a small mechanical dog with a slinky neck. The cat would say some very funny things in which rubbery black strips that were attached to the cat would rise and fall with every comment. I noticed Seven bouncing up and down with excitement as the next show started. You could say it was along the lines of a Captain Kangaroo, except this show really wasn't meant for kids. It was called the Satanic Cowboy Show, and you knew the show was over when a bugle would blow and the Satanic Cowboy would bleed from his anus. Personally, I can't really get into this stuff, but Gray and Seven seemed very entertained. I was in the middle of a good book myself, but was interrupted by the sound of a bugle, followed by an audience jeering in disgust, followed by Seven applauding. My attention was quickly regained as I could hear a loud commercial for the reopening of Night Beach. This was a location spot that had been closed down for years due to the ocean completely covering it after a massive storm. My guess is that the water finally receded after all this time. Gray looked at me with big watery eyes begging to go, Seven looked on in disappointment as she could not attend. She had to go to her night job called Screams. Her job consists of basically standing on a street corner yelling at passing cars. They sometimes throw her money or steaming hot coffee. Honestly, I really don't know the point of her job exactly. I just know that's what she does. Gray was excited over the idea of a vacation and that Seven would not be attending. The next day, we didn't waste any time, as we immediately left. As we began on our journey, we drove past Seven, only to be screamed at. I threw her some loose change, and Gray threw some steaming hot coffee at her with a malevolent grin. We arrived to our location and parked. The night beach, of course, never saw much light of the day, thus giving it its name. There were people laying out in towels and beach umbrellas all arranged in the sand. There were children running around playing frisbee, yet everyone was very silent. You could really only hear the waves and people whispering to each other. There were people pushing wheelbarrows full of what seemed to be small squid and hermit crabs and random shells. I was going to ask where they were going when a small man who looked very familiar came out from under the boardwalk with a top hat and vest. He quietly exclaimed the ride was now open and gestured for the two of us to come under the boardwalk. As we slouched down, we saw what almost looked like a cellar door that we had to crawl into. Once inside, we were asked to be seated in a small roller coaster cars which were on a track. The room was dark, and there were no lights, just some random candles lit. We could hear gears starting to grind, and our carts slowly moved along the tracks. We were taken into what seemed like an old thrift store. Just rows of old clothes on racks were brushing our arms as we were seated, slowly moving in between these rows of clothes. We started to go on a slant that appeared very unsafe. The tracks seemed to be held together by pieces of wood. It looked as if we were going up a stairwell of an abandoned home in the dark. As we went around a bend leading to another incline, a mechanical puppet popped from the wall. It appeared broken and said some sort of advertisement to a business that closed years ago. The ride finally ended in a room full of large rotted plastic figures, I'm guessing from destroyed boardwalk attractions from the flood. The safety bars lifted, and we got up from our seats and followed a painted, glowing arrow, which led us to an exit. We were both pretty tired from the long trip and the strange ride we just finished, and were very hungry as well. I thought to myself, I wonder how Seven is doing. I later found out that Seven was doing just fine, actually. While we were on our little vacation, Seven was screaming at a school bus full of children stuck in a traffic jam. This is what Screams considers a golden opportunity to make money. And the children just looked on, completely terrified. Chapter 12. The Haunted Grocery Store. We came across an old sign that read, Haunted Grocery Store. Beware of ghosts and cheap prices. This was something we couldn't pass up. We entered a darkened store that was lit only by black lights, so all the products seemed to glow. There was a cardboard cutout of a ghost that read, You must be this haunted to save on daily prices. The floor of the store was checkerboard black and white tiles, and because of the lighting, the white squares seemed to glow with intensity. We began stocking our cart for our stay, which would only be another day. So we picked up some devil dogs, which looked like little hot dogs but with horns. We grabbed some angel hair pasta, which came in a halo-style ball. Gray noticed a microwavable hamburger called Beaselburger, endorsed by the Satanic Cowboy. Surprise, surprise. On the package, it said, Eat before midnight, or it will eat you. Gray read this odd warning and laughed as he tossed it into the cart. The produce section was all different glowing types of fruits and vegetables. There were scarecrows, with crudely carved pumpkin heads that would turn and stare at you as you perused through the vegetables. To our surprise, there were transparent shop clerks that were floating in the air and dropping coupons from time to time. The checkout lines were pretty unique. They were set up exactly like normal checkout lines, yet There were no shop clerks working behind the registers. There were, however, Ouija boards grafted to a stand right before the conveyor belt lines. After a couple minutes of confusion, we noticed underneath the Ouija board was written, "Ask a question." Gray asked if there was someone here to help us check out. The cursor slowly moved to yes. Slowly, the products we had placed in the cart rose out and levitated over the scanner bed. This interaction continued till we finished our transaction. We all left the strange glowing grocery store, all excited to get back to our hotel. We booked a hotel for the night at the Sand Turtle Lodge, which was a pretty prime location spot at the night beach. Chapter 13. The Church with No Walls. The Sand Turtle Lodge was pretty unique. The rooms were normally furnished with a bed and dresser, kitchen and bathroom. However, the floor was all sand, like you never even left the beach. There were small hermit crabs crawling around the room, combing out the sand in all different patterns. The wallpaper of the room seemed to be made from old maps from the maritime era. After a night there, we decided to venture on the outskirts of town to a neighboring village, which was a tourist attraction mainly due to, well, the church with no walls. It was a somewhat odd setup, really. Basically a marble floor with pews, altar, and obviously no walls. You were completely surrounded by the hillsides and the meadows. Far away in the distance, you could see homes perched up on hills, and all the paths led to this open church. As we stood within, we could hear a clock tower bell toll, and at that very moment, a crowd of tourists gathered to watch what seemed to be a humanoid figure slowly descending from the clouds. As this object came closer to the ground, it appeared to be a statue of a Romanesque human figure. As it landed to the ground in what seemed to be a designated spot, everyone started taking photos. After about 5 minutes, the statue rose again and lifted into the sky. I was told by one of the onlookers that this happened once every 3 hours. We decided to go downtown to a local restaurant, a buffet-style Asian cuisine located underground. The interior was really ornate, with highly detailed reds and yellow design on the chairs and tables. We were surrounded by fountains with lush vegetation and odd colorful sea life. There seemed to be rocky walls that the restaurant was built around, and within these walls were holes. Every once in a while, a great white serpent with a head that resembled a horse with a red mane would make its way from one hole to the next, slithering around like gravity was not an issue. We were greeted by a server who was completely painted blue with an ornate headdress. She asked us for our drink order, and we quickly made our way to the buffet. Gray and I were hungry and made a couple trips back and forth, filling up our plates as much as we could. There was an arrangement of all different types of strange and obscure delights at the buffet. After a great deal of time, we hadn't noticed that our plates were piling up at the table. As we started on our dessert, we noticed the servers talking amidst each other and looking over at us. Gray didn't seem to notice. He just continued eating his food without hesitation. I looked back down to continue eating when I noticed from my periphery that the blue hostess was making her way to our table. The hostess pulled out a chair and sat at our table in a somewhat meditative state. After a moment of silence, she just looked at Gray and I and watched us eat. I asked her if there was a problem, in which she replied, "I believe you have eaten too much." In which then she lowered her head and began praying in some strange language. Gray was somewhat put off by her and continued eating anyway. The server then looked up at Gray, almost as if he had disturbed her meditative state, and at that very moment something happened that startled both of us. As she lowered her head and closed her eyes to begin in her prayer, a third eye revealed itself from the center of her head. She then said again, "I believe you've eaten too much," followed by a prayer once more. I found myself wanting to leave. There were 2 fortune cookies at the table. I quickly opened mine, revealing the message, "Life doesn't need to answer your questions." I found this odd, but not as odd as Gray's fortune, which was simply a drawing of a decapitated stick figure.
is from 7 p.m. to midnight. It will also be open on Halloween night.